What's up everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to make this awesome looking scene without actually having to do any modeling itself. I'm going to walk you through everything that you need to know, from adding the meshes, to shading, to lighting, and rendering. But before we get started, make sure you check out my previous video on getting started with Blender, since I'm going to be building on some of the topics that were covered in that video. So let's head on over to Blender now and open up a fresh scene. And like usual, I have the screencast keys enabled down here at the bottom right, so you can see every button that I press along with every mouse click. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to get rid of every object in the scene because honestly, we don't need any of them, at least not yet. And now we're going to need to enable some add-ons, and add-ons are pretty neat because they add some extra functionality to Blender. And a lot of them are actually already pre-packaged with Blender and just need to be enabled. So, let's head on over to our preferences. And make sure you select the add-ons tab. And here, just search for the extra objects add-on. And you're going to see two of them. We want the second one. We want the add mesh extra objects. Okay, so once you have that checked off, you can X out. So now we're going to add the pyramid objects, so press Shift A, head over to meshes, and go all the way down to the extras. Here we will find some extra objects, and what we want is the step pyramid. And there it is, there's the pyramid object. I'm just going to zoom in on it really quickly so that you can see it. Now Blender is really awesome because it allows us to use a non-destructive workflow, and what that means is I can make changes to this basic shape without actually having to modify any of the vertices. So as you may remember from last time, we can go ahead and enter edit mode and change the position and rotation scale of some of these vertices and faces, and that will create an entirely different shape. But we actually don't have to do that, at least to some extent, because Blender allows us to use these things called modifiers. And so we can find these modifiers over here on the right hand side, and it's under this little wrench icon. So if we click on that, you'll see you have an option here to add some modifiers. So let's open that up, and if I remember correctly, there are 42 different modifiers. I'm not really sure about that though, don't quote me on that. And the modifier that we want to use is the bevel modifier. And as you can see, this has changed the shape of the pyramid. However, I have not actually modified any of the vertices within the shape. And I can toggle this modifier on and off by pressing on this little computer screen here. So this enables the real-time display in the viewport. So this is with the modifier on, and this is without the modifier on. Alrighty, so I'm going to turn that back on, and one of the uses for the bevel modifier is that it allows us to smooth out our shape. And so here I'm going to add 2 segments and decrease the amount. So I'm going to hold down the shift key, and that will allow me to decrease the amount by small increments. And you can see what type of effect this is having already on the shape. A bigger amount will smooth over the edges, and the smaller amount will sharpen those edges just a tiny bit, just to make it look a little bit more realistic. Okay, but now you may notice that there are these edges in the shape. So in order to get rid of those edges, we need to right click on the pyramid and select smooth shading, and so that gets rid of all of those extra edges that we've added. And there you go. So again, I'm going to turn off the bevel modifier so you can see what this pyramid looks like without it. And the smooth shading is causing some weird effects, so I'm going to switch over to flat shading. And then with the bevel modifier enabled, you have a different style of the very same pyramid. Okay. So with that added, now let's add the diamond that's going to go on top here of the pyramid. So again, we're going to press Shift A, and now head on over to the diamonds option. And here you have 3 different options for diamonds. I'm just going to select the gem, and there it is. And now we just have to position it to where we want. So I'm just going to quickly move that over and then scale it down. That should be fine for now. We can mess around with it later. Okay, and the very last shape that we're going to need is this bend your spud shape that can be found under the extras option. So now let's just position it in the scene and scale it down. Get it from the front orthographic. Okay, so I'm going to be making some more changes to this shape, and I'm going to enter what is known as local view. And this can be done by pressing the slash key on your keyboard. And so now I've focused in on this shape, and all of the other ones have gone away for now. Okay, so I want to bring down this cube so that it's going to be level with the rest of the objects within the scene. Now what I want to do is make a stack here of these cubes. So I'm going to right click on the cube, and what I want to do is create a linked duplicate. So I'm just going to select that option and move it to the side a little bit. So again, I'm going to create another linked duplicate, and just very briefly I'm going to explain the difference. So we want to use a linked duplicate because when we start shading, we can just use the same material for every shape, and that will really save a lot of time. Additionally, if we wanted to add modifiers to all of these cube shapes, I can just add it to one cube, and that will be copied over to the other cubes in the scene. But if I create just a regular duplicate, that won't be as easily accomplished. It can still be done, it can still copy over modifiers and materials, but the linked duplicate helps us to avoid any of those intermediate steps. And it saves on memory, so that's another plus. So I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to position it on top of both of these two. Right there should be fine. Okay. And now the problem is that I want to move all of these cubes at the same time. So for example, if I select this top cube, if I move it, then I want to move the other ones along with it. So let's quickly do that. Select both of the bottom cubes by holding down Shift, and then select the top cube. And as you can see, there's going to be a yellow outline along the last object that you select. You want to make sure the yellow outline is on this top cube and not on any of these bottom cubes. And now press Ctrl P or Command P depending on what operating system you have, and just select object. Okay, so now when we move this top cube, all of the other cubes will follow. So that's essentially what I wanted to do here. If I move this bottom one though, I will still be able to move just a single one. So that's something that you need to keep in mind if you ever want to modify this shape overall. And now to exit the local view, I'm going to press the slash on my keyboard again, and I can see that this shape is still entirely too big, so I'm just going to scale it down, and then again bring it down on the Z-axis. Yeah, that should be fine. Okay, and let's position it a little bit closer to the pyramid. And let's rotate it like that. And again, we can mess around with the positioning and rotation later on once we're finalizing the scene. So now let's create more copies of this stack of cubes. And I'm going to create some more link duplicates, so I'm going to press Alt D and just reposition these across the scene. And now to add a little bit of variability to it, just going to rotate them around. And that brings me to my next topic, the rotation pivot. If you click up here, you'll be able to select different pivot points to rotate around. Right now, the default one is set to the median point. So what that does is, if I select an object, I will rotate this object around the median point. So what Blender will do is look at the shape of the object and find the median point to rotate around, which is fine for some cases, but for what I want to accomplish next, it won't. So what I'm going to do is highlight this front stack here and change the rotation pivot to individual origins. So now when I rotate, all of the cubes will be rotated around their own individual rotation pivots. So that just helps to add some variability to how these stacks look. Okay, and that pretty much finalizes what the final scene is going to look like. But right now, if I were to render out this scene, all of these objects are going to be floating out in space. So let's quickly add a ground object, and that will be done through a plane. Let's scale this plane up a little bit. That should be fine. And now let's add a camera, because without a camera we won't be able to render anything. The camera is down here. And let's position it roughly to where we would want it to be. Now let's enter the camera view. And I can see that none of the objects that I actually want are going to be rendered with the camera positioning being the way that it is now. So in order to change that, I can press Shift tilde, and the tilde key is above the tab key on the left side of your keyboard. And that will allow me to move the camera with my mouse, and then also with the WASD keys. So I can use these now to just move around the scene and just position the shape roughly to where I want it. Okay, now let's make just some final adjustments here to the scene. Okay, I think that will work fine for now. Now let's change the size of this camera. So head on over here to the output properties, and let's change the resolution to 1600 by 1200. And that just changes the aspect ratio a little bit to a 4:3 aspect ratio. And we're going to need to reposition the camera now. Just about there should be fine. Let me scale the plane. Okay. So our scene is looking pretty good. Now we just have to add some materials and lighting. Now we can add materials through the 3D viewport where we are now, but Blender already has a workspace for us to do that more easily. So that can be found up here under the shading tab, and if we click on that, you can see that all of our objects will turn white because they have no material. So let's quickly add some materials to these objects. Let's start with the pyramid. You're going to click here on the new button, And let's change that material to a orangish color, or you can select whatever you want if you want to get more creative with it. And let's increase this roughness. The roughness will determine how shiny the object will be in the end. So I just want this to not be shiny at all. I'm going to turn that up to 1. Let's turn this gem, let's add a new material, into a bluish color. That should be fine. And now I want these cubes to have roughly the same color as the diamond. And now you see the benefit of the linked duplicates. They allow me to add a material to just one of those cubes, and that will be copied over to the other ones. Okay, and lastly, let's change the color of this ground. And that should be fine. Okay, let's head on over back to the layout workspace. And now the materials will be gone, but we can quickly turn that back on by heading up here and selecting the viewport shading. But the way our scene looks like right now is a little flat. So we need to add some lighting, and lighting is what can either make or break the scene. So in order to add a light, press Shift A again, and we want a light object. And for the purposes of this scene in this tutorial, we just need an area light. And now let's position it above the scene here. And over on the right hand side, you can modify some of those properties of that light. So we can change things like the color, the power, and the shape of the light, which are the most important right now. So let's change this to a disc. And I'm going to increase the power to 150. But you may notice that nothing is actually happening here in the scene. And that is because we need to enter a different mode to look at how the lights interact with the materials. And that is this last option here. So let's enter the rendered mode. And now you can see how the light is affecting this scene. So it's looking relatively okay. Let's just change the color. I want this color to be a bluish color to really bring out the color of the gem. Okay, that should be fine. Let's just bring it up a little bit. But I'm getting these really harsh shadows. So if we mess around with the size of the light, you can see that the shadows get either sharper or softer depending on that size. So I'm just gonna increase the size there to about 3.2. That's okay. That gets rid of a lot of the harsh shadows. And now let's add some more lights to the scene. We're just gonna be copying over to this exact same process. So we're gonna duplicate the light using Shift D. Now we're creating a normal duplicate and not a linked duplicate. And then just cancel the movement by right clicking on your mouse. We're going to change the pivot point, the rotation pivot point, to be the 3D cursor. So now when I rotate this light, I will still rotate around the world origin. So let's scale this down a little bit. Actually, no, I don't want to scale it down. I'm going to decrease the size, just so it affects the shadows differently. And I want to move it out. But I want to move it out in its local Z direction. And so I need to press G and then Z twice. And that will allow me to move the light in the direction that I want. Let's go back to camera view. And now let's change the color of this light. right about there. That seems to be fine. I'm also going to change the intensity to 100. And let's bring it over a little bit closer. Okay. And now you can see this nice gradient that's starting to form out of these lights interacting with the materials of the objects. So now I'm just going to readjust the color of the first light. Make it a darker blue. And then bring it up a little bit. Okay. I might modify that later, but for right now the scene is looking fine. I'm going to copy that middle light again using Shift D and then rotating around the world origin. And I'm going to make this light a slight orange yellow color, or a tan color I guess, and bring that intensity down to about 15. I don't want it to be intense at all, but I do want it to be closer to the pyramid so that it brings out some of the material, some of the accents from that color. So something like that will do just fine. And now let's just position the lights a little bit better so that it's coming in from the right angle. Okay, something like that is fine for now. So, let's talk about rendering engines. The rendering engine that we're using right now is called Eevee, and Eevee is great for some things, and for other things it's not so great, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of what those differences are between Eevee and the other rendering engine known as Cycles, but we're going to be using Cycles to render out this scene. So let's head on over here to the render properties and change the render engine to Cycles. And so Cycles is just, it interacts with the light better in the scene, and that's really as technical as we need to get right now. So let's just keep modifying these lights and the scene the way we want. I'm going to disable the cast shadows option here for this light on the left. And now it's just all about experimenting. So move around the lights. Okay, so I think this is fine for now. We can change the lighting of the world in general by affecting the color and strength. So if we change the color of the world, you can see that will bring in a different sort of vibe, or you can see that will bring in a different feel to the rest of the scene. To make it either lighter or darker, depending on what type of colors we want to bring out. Okay, now I'm going to make some last minute tweaks here, and then we'll be pretty much good to go to render the scene. Now the last thing to finish up the scene is to just really bring out the contrast of it. So we're going to head on over here to the render properties, and under color management we're going to change the look to a medium high contrast. and you can see the effect that this has on the scene overall. I'll show you really quickly just the medium contrast, and you can play around with this as well, but I think a medium high contrast is probably okay to use for now. Alright, so let's render this scene. In order to render it, we need to head on over here to the render tab and just click on render image. Okay, so this is how our image was rendered out. I think it's looking pretty nice, but I'm gonna just experiment with it a little bit more and see what I can make of it. Okay, so now that my scene has been rendered, I just want to go through some of the differences here. This was the first image that I rendered, and this is the finalized one. So you can see I just fixed up a little bit of the lighting, a little bit of the materials there, and I moved around and changed some of the lighting, some of the lights, as well as messed around with the world lighting. Okay, so now the last thing that you're going to need to do to completely save your image is click here under the image tab, and you want to click on this save button, and you want to click on this save option, and from there Blender will prompt you to save it to a specific directory, and that is the very last step for completing this scene. Alrighty everyone, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope that was useful to get you started with shading and lighting without having to worry about the 3D modeling aspect of things. I know that can be kind of daunting sometimes, especially for beginners. And so there you have it, a beautiful looking scene with just some very basic shapes, which we never had to model. And please, feel free to experiment with more lights, with different colors, make it your own. That's what it's all about, making it your own style so that you can expand and keep building on your art. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button so that you can show some support, and I can keep making more videos exactly like this to get you started on your Blender journey. Here are some other videos that you might like that I've done in the past, applying some of these very techniques. Thank you all so much for watching. Until next time.